Friedrich Heinrich Karl Haarmann, or Fritz Haarmann, had many names by the time of his death on April 15th of 1925. His monikers included the Wolfman, the Vampire of Hanover, or perhaps most infamously, the Butcher of Hanover. Fritz Haarmann was born in Hanover, Germany on October 25th of 1879. He was the sixth and youngest child of parents Ollie and Joanna Haarmann, but it was anything but happy families in the Haarmann household. According to various rumours, Fritz's father, Ollie Haarmann, had only married Joanna for her money. Joanna was 41 years old and 7 years older than Ollie when they were married, but she came with a substantial dowry. On the other hand, Joanna had her own reasons for marrying Ollie, and love didn't seem to be one of them. At the age that she was, Joanna knew that she was at a crossroads in her life, and that this could be one of her last chances to have children of her own. So Joanna chose to marry Ollie, a man with a foul temper and a strict authoritarian nature, but his sense of morals and rules didn't always apply to himself. Almost as soon as the ink had dried on their marriage certificate, he began having affairs. At one point, he even contracted syphilis, which only worsened his difficult personality and aggravated his temper. But Joanna stayed with him until she died in 1901, leaving behind 6 children and a cantankerous and very sick widower husband. Perhaps taking the comfort that she could out of life, Joanna was known to often spoil and pamper the person that others would go on to call her favourite child, Fritz Haarmann. Again, Fritz was the baby of the family, and from a young age, he loved spending time with his mother. He was quieter, a little more gentle than the other boys, including Joanna's other sons. By the time he started school in 1886, one of his favourite things to do was to be at home with his mother, playing with his sister's dolls and learning how to sew. His teachers found him difficult to work with and often complained to his parents that Fritz spent most of his time in lessons not listening, daydreaming and staring out of the window. It couldn't have been a surprise to anyone that he did rather poorly in school. He was disinterested and easily bored and had to repeat the same year 3 times, but things only grew worse when he turned 8 years old. At that incredibly young age, one of Fritz's teachers molested him, and that forever changed him and the course of his life. After that, Fritz didn't exactly like school more than he had before, but the changes in him were quite drastic, and they happened very quickly. Overnight, Fritz reimagined himself. He switched out all of his clothes, always had a slick haircut, and began focusing on his appearance, always making sure that he looked the absolute best that he possibly could. By 1894, he lost interest in school entirely and dropped out to start working instead. He became an apprentice locksmith in Neuf-Brisach, which is now a part of France and is far away from Hanover. This meant that it was also far away from Fritz's family as well, and that could have been exactly what Fritz had been looking for, given how difficult his life was at home. But his job at Neuf-Brisach didn't last long though. Fritz changed his mind and decided to go to military school instead, and at the time it really looked like it was the right move for him to make. The strict schedule grounded him, and being away from his parents seemed to give him that fresh start that he needed for him to actually start doing well in his classes. But unsurprisingly, it didn't take long for things to take another turn for Fritz, and this time things were deadly serious. Fritz's teachers at the military school didn't complain that he was spacing out in lessons and not paying attention. What they did have to say, however, was something far more concerning and potentially far more dangerous. When he was only 15 years old, Fritz started passing out. No one could figure out why, and sometimes Fritz simply wouldn't remember what he'd been doing for hours at a time. It was like looking at a clock and looking back at it a second later, only to realise that half a day had gone by, instead of a mere second. Medical professionals weren't equipped to help Fritz or treat his unknown condition. He was eventually diagnosed as having something similar to epilepsy, but that wasn't quite it either. His doctor said that Fritz had anxiety neurosis, which basically meant that he would lose consciousness or time whenever he experienced high levels of anxiety or stress. Perhaps realising that this meant he could never have a career in the military, only a month after his diagnosis, Fritz left military school. He moved back to Hanover and back in with his family. By then, his father had created a cigar company using Joanna's dowry, and Fritz started working for him to make some extra money. But within the year, it became perfectly clear that Fritz was heading down a dark path. When he was only 16 years old, Fritz started coaxing young boys into following him into secluded areas. Sometimes he offered them sweets or money, sometimes he said he had a job for them to do, but once Fritz had them where he wanted them, he sexually assaulted them. In 1896, 2 full years after Fritz had started assaulting young boys, he was finally caught and arrested. He then had the extra charge of being a homosexual hanging over his head, as well as the assaults, potentially landing Fritz in some seriously hot water under German law at the time, when homosexuality was illegal. But law enforcement took things into a different direction when it came to sentencing him. Perhaps seeing his diagnosis as one of the reasons behind his crimes, they actually sent Fritz to a mental institution to check if he was mentally competent to stand trial. This sounded like a great idea at first, but the institution couldn't figure out how to diagnose Fritz, and they ended up sending him to a hospital instead. The hospital managed to do a psychiatric evaluation on him, and the results forever changed many lives, and most definitely not in the way it had intended. Psychologist Gert Schmalfuss declared Fritz as mentally incompetent, meaning that he couldn't be tried for his crimes. Schmalfuss described Fritz as, quote, incurably deranged, and advised the courts to have him committed indefinitely to a mental institution. The courts agreed, and they sent Fritz to an institution, not a prison, which was part of the reason why Joanna could arrange for him to escape only 7 months later. Joanna got Fritz out to Switzerland, where he stayed with some of her relatives for about 3 years. There in Switzerland, he reinvented himself once again, meaning that when he returned to Hanover in 1899, he was ready for a fresh start and a new life. Finally back in his hometown and distant from the crimes that he had committed in the first place, Fritz met a woman. Her name was Erna Lovert, and when she became pregnant with Fritz's child, they got engaged. But before they could get married, Fritz was called away to do his mandatory military service. This was Fritz's golden era. By his own account, he described his time in the military as the happiest times of his life. It turned out that he was a great shot, and that earned him respect from his fellow soldiers. He was well behaved, admired, and he was about to become a father. It looked like things couldn't get better for Fritz, but things took a turn once again. He realised that it had been a long time since he'd heard from Erna, and he should have by then. It had been a year since he'd started his military service, and Erna had been pregnant when he left. As the days turned into weeks and then months, and Fritz still hadn't heard anything from Erna about the baby, he began to fear the worst, and then, one day, he collapsed whilst doing an exercise. With his condition worsening, Fritz was honourably discharged from the military. He spent 4 months in treatment in a hospital before he was released with a diagnosis of probable dementia and sent back home to Hanover. There he learnt the truth and found out that Erna had had an abortion, and his mental health took another serious hit. He had his pension from the military, but trying to make some extra money, Fritz began working at Ollie's cigar company once again. This didn't help with anything though, and only ended with the both of them filing lawsuits against each other. Ollie went as far as to try to get Fritz committed again, but the two of them managed to find common ground when Erna announced that she was once again pregnant. Not wanting to miss his opportunity to have a family of his own, Fritz did everything he could to keep Erna happy, and Ollie, rather surprisingly, helped him. Ollie gave Fritz and Erna money and helped them set up a fishmongery so that they would have their own way of making money. The couple worked there together until Fritz accused Erna of having an affair, and Erna subsequently kicked him out. Fritz didn't have a legal leg to stand on. Erna had had everything, including the fishmongery, put in her name, and Fritz was left out in the cold. The only thing he had by this point was his pension from the military, and that was barely enough to get by. Instead of looking for work, Fritz took to the streets, stealing property and selling it off again. He wasn't exactly sly or quick about it either, and spent most of his time between 1905 and 1912 serving one sentence or another. That was until 1913, when he was charged with a string of burglaries and he was sentenced to 5 full years in prison. He returned to Hanover once again when he was released, and this time he found himself around the local police station for a different reason entirely. Fritz became an informant. He regularly stopped by the station to tell the police what was going on in the neighbourhood and who was doing it, and in return, they turned a blind eye to Fritz and the endless supply of merchandise he always seemed to have on him. But that wasn't the only reason why Fritz was always around the police station. He wanted to know exactly what the police were up to, and he wanted to know if they suspected him of being up to anything a bit more serious than selling stolen goods. By 1918, Fritz was back to luring young boys into secluded areas, only this time the secluded area was his own apartment. There, he did a lot more than sexually assaulting them too, and there were very few people who lived to tell the tale. Fritz would bite into his victims' Adam's apple, sometimes biting so hard and so deeply that he would sever their tracheas. Fritz later explained that this was what he called his love bite, and that he did it to each and every one of his victims. After that, he either let them bleed to death or he strangled them. He then dismembered their bodies and threw the pieces into the River Lane. His first known victim was a 17-year-old boy named Friedel Roth. Friedel disappeared from school one day, and Fritz even wrote a letter explaining why the boy was missing. When Friedel's family realised that something was wrong, the letter was traced back to Fritz Haarmann, and the police came barging into his apartment. They found Fritz in bed with a 13-year-old boy, potentially and probably saving the boy's life in the process, but they somehow managed to miss the boys they'd been looking for in the first place. Fritz later admitted that Friedel's head had been wrapped up in newspapers and hidden behind the oven at the same time the police had raided the apartment. The police didn't find Friedel's remains, and Fritz was only charged with sexual assault and battery of a minor. He was sentenced to 9 months in prison, but almost unbelievably, he managed to talk his way out of serving his sentence, and he was released. Almost immediately, he returned to luring young boys back to his apartment, usually from the Hanover station. It was there that he met 18-year-old Hans Granz, probably thinking that their night was about to go like so many others had before, and Hans would soon be dead at the bottom of the Lane River. But Hans was different to Fritz's previous victims. Hans had nothing and nobody, and was sleeping in the station because he had nowhere else to go. He was the perfect and the usual target that Fritz went for, but perhaps realising that he could get a place to sleep if he went along with Fritz, Hans did everything Fritz asked him to do. He slept with Fritz and played to his vanity, and in the meantime, Hans learned everything he could about Fritz and the crimes he was involved in. Hans was particularly interested in Fritz's business of selling second-hand clothing, and it didn't take him long to figure out where Fritz was getting his supplies from. According to Fritz, Hans walked in one day to find the body of one of Fritz's victims still lying on the bed. Hans had then looked at the body, looked back at Fritz, and just asked what time he should come back. Realising he was with someone who would just accept him and all of his crimes, the tables turned, and Fritz began doing everything he could to make sure that Hans stayed with him. Hans picked out the targets, usually because of their clothes, and Fritz killed them. Long before, they'd racked up over 27 victims, and despite the close eye that Fritz was keeping on them down at the station, the police were beginning to suspect that there was more to their informant than he was letting on. They arrested Fritz and searched his apartment, finding several items of their victims' clothing. But it was when they told Fritz that they'd also found some of their possessions on Hans that Fritz broke down and confessed to being the Butcher of Hanover. Fritz claimed in his confession to have a murder count that reached somewhere between the 50s and 70s. He later changed that to be between the 70s and the 90s, but he claimed to have only killed 24 out of the 27 missing men that the police were looking for. Fritz kept Hans out of his confession at first, but the police didn't believe that Hans had nothing to do with the murders. Eventually, Fritz cracked and admitted that Hans had orchestrated some of the murders and even committed others himself. He then claimed that Hans had tried to convince Fritz that he'd murdered some of Hans's victims, but had forgotten doing it because he'd had an episode. Hans, of course, denied everything and claimed that he had no idea that Fritz had been murdering men to steal their clothes, but the police had a hard time believing him. They were both tried and both pled not guilty, but Fritz decided to represent himself in court. The truth is that a not guilty by reason of insanity plea would have been a viable option here for Fritz, but he ended up filing the paperwork incorrectly, and that resulted in him being found guilty of the 24 murders he'd confessed to. Hans was found guilty of accessory to murder and to one count of murder for a man whose suit he'd wanted Fritz to get. Both of them were sentenced to death by guillotine, but Hans managed to appeal his verdict. His sentence was commuted to 12 years imprisonment after Fritz wrote a letter in his defence, saying that Hans had had nothing to do with the murders and that he'd only said that because the police had forced him to. Hans served his sentence, part of it in a concentration camp after the end of World War II, before he moved back to Hanover and died in 1975. Fritz didn't appeal his sentence, and by some accounts was said to be relieved by it. That was until he made it up to the guillotine, where he made his now rather infamous speech. Quote, "I am guilty, gentlemen," he said, "but hard though it may be, I want to die as a man. I repent, but I do not fear death." The official accounts say that he was pale and shaking before putting his head on the block, But either way, this death marked the end of what was later called the most revolting case in German history.